Hello, and welcome back to AP World History with Miss Muir.
And Mr. Yarsowich.
Today we're going to be examining Key Concept 1.3, which is all about the development of the first civilizations. Please take a moment to pause the video and read through in the Period 1 packet handout the big picture section for Key Concept 1.3. Okay. Here we see a map of the first civilizations. So you're going to want to examine this map in more detail, perhaps pause now or come back later. Also, this map is available on the topics page. You need to make note of the key geography as well as the location of each of these first civilizations. Also, if you look in your textbook on page 22, there's a great map that shows the development of agriculture in these areas and lists specific types of plants and animals grown in each area. Great, so we see the first civilizations emerge. So what is a first state or a core civilization? What we're talking about here is a turning point in world history where we see very large permanent settlements develop. And they're developing in areas that were, of course, good for farming, because in order to be settled, you have to have access to a steady food supply. So in this case, that's agriculture. So what we see a common pattern for these civilizations is either near a water source or in an area that had consistent rainfall. Something else that we see that's different about these first civilizations versus the earlier Neolithic villages is that we see rulers emerge that have a lot of power. These rulers have the power to what we call mobilize resources. So mobilize means to sort of gather together and direct for a purpose. And so what are these rulers mobilizing? They're mobilizing mostly labor and resources. And what are they doing with the labor and resources? Well, they're getting things done that are essential to society. For example, in this image, you see laborers working to construct the pyramids in Egypt. Monumental architecture, digging of irrigation ditches, and also building or constructing fortifications for the protection of the society. You see in this image of a Mesopotamian city, you can see that there's a moat around the city. There are city walls for defense. Also note the ziggurat as a sort of a central part of the town.
That pyramidic garden, religious center, political center too, really.
Yeah. So these rulers have the power to mobilize resources and people. Now, what gives them that power? We see this concept called divine right develop. Divine right means the rulers are using some kind of religious justification for why they're in charge. What is the advantage of ruling through divine right? You're saying that sort of the God or the gods is on your side, and it helps limit rebellion against your authority.
And that's reinforced through both of these images we've seen, the ziggurat and the pyramids. Both of those have a sort of dual function of religious worship, especially with the ziggurat, but also reinforcing the power of the leaders who are mobilizing the labor to build these buildings. In addition to agriculture, there's other ways that geography influences the development of the first states. Here's a map of the ancient Middle East and the different types of metals that could be found. We mentioned in a previous video that metallurgy was an important development as the Neolithic Revolution went on. And this is where your civilization could benefit from being in the right place. So here you see there's two locations where iron was found in the ancient Middle East.
And what makes iron so important?
Well, just as bronze was better than stone, iron's better than bronze. And if you have iron deposits, you can make iron weapons. And the Hittites were some of the first in the Middle East to make those weapons because their geography favored them with those deposits. They added that with chariots and horse-drawn chariots, and the result was conquest. So, state expansion in the regions where first civilizations developed, it occurred through mostly bloody conquest. And here you can see in blue the Hittite Empire. But notice how crowded the Fertile Crescent and Egypt are getting. Right? Different civilizations are competing with each other: Babylon, Egypt, Hittites, and other leaders. Why build empires? Well,
Yeah, good
this
question.
kind of goes to the original point of the developing agriculture. The more food, the more stuff you have, the more wealth you have, and so there's an incentive there. If you want to build pyramids, it helps to have slaves.
Right.
So where do you get those slaves from? Conquest.
Take them from other lands.
Take them from other lands.
Yeah, it's really the search for access to more resources that is driving the building of these early empires.
We can see two early empires on this map that developed in this region of Mesopotamia. Ultimately, the Akkadians were the first to unite the regions along the rivers of Babylon, and then again uniting the different upper and lower kingdoms in Egypt along the Nile River. Pastoralists didn't go away. They had weapons and modes of transportation that gave them great advantages. The composite or compound bow was very important. It was just a long-range, deadlier weapon. And of course, riding on horseback meant you could fire your weapon and ride away, and you had longer range. They were quite effective in using these new technologies for their conquest as well.
That's right. And the pastoralists were essential in helping to spread these new types of weapons and transportation to other settled civilizations. So they weren't the only ones using this stuff. They just helped spread it around as they came into contact with settled societies. Okay, early civilizations developed distinct cultures. Here we see an image of a big head. Yes, that's what it's called. That was made in the Olmec society in Mesoamerica. Now, this is an example of monumental art. And an important pattern that emerges with these civilizations is that culture helps unify the societies. So how does it do it? How does culture help unify society? You can think of it as being kind of like school spirit, right? Everyone is sharing in the same kind of art. They're sharing in the similar religious practices and beliefs. And it really helps bring people together because they're all sort of doing the same thing. In the same way that school spirit, having things like neon night or
pep rallies.
Right, pep rallies help build a uniform culture.
Can you just imagine stumbling through the jungle and finding this head that's nearly twice your size? It's also a reminder of who's in charge,
right.
Perhaps.
Absolutely. So we see in this example of the cities in the Indus Valley in South Asia. We're looking at a picture of the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro. And so in this picture, what we see in the background is a citadel. So that's an example of the fortifications that the rulers would have mobilized labor to produce. And in the foreground, we see
Urban planning?
distinct signs of urban planning. So you can the cities in the Indus Valley were actually set out on a grid pattern, which means they had straight streets that intersected at right angles. And we also see perhaps a public bath off to the left of the screen. And so these are examples of intentional planning on the part of rulers to make a great civilization. Now we're going to look at examples from other civilizations in class. So all of those terms that you see on the left-hand side of your paper, we'll get into defining those and giving examples in class time. On this slide, we see an example of elites sponsoring art. So specifically, this is a bronze vessel from China. And why is it that elites, in other words, people with higher social status, whether it's political or religious, why do they tend to sponsor art and artisanship? Well, most often it's because the art is a great way to show everyone else how powerful you are. So the specific pieces of artwork that you commission and the more decorative the temples and palaces and government buildings are, the better impression you're giving the people that you are very powerful. And it's a reminder of how powerful you are, like who the ruler is and why they are so powerful.
And this particular vessel was a ritual vessel used for offerings to heaven and to the ancestors, and it actually inscribes on it a story about reinforcing divine right. So as people are engaging in these religious rituals, there's emphasis again on the ruler was chosen by heaven or by the gods or God to be in power, and it's an important way of reinforcing your power. Other developments of the first civilizations, systems of record keeping. This is really the origins of written language. Here, you see an example from the Andes Mountains, Quipu. It's a form of record keeping by knots, and you can see along the right there just how, I guess, a scribe really,
works. Yeah, exactly.
how the system works. And this was really for facilitating trade.
Yeah.
Similar thing with cuneiform in the Middle East. Literally, it's a number system that is adapted later into a written language.
And again, we're going to go into more specific details about each type of record system in class. So we'll be helping you define and give examples of those terms during class activities.
Yeah, cuneiform hieroglyphics and so forth. But once you have a precedent for recording things, you can adapt that for other purposes.
Right.
And rulers did that through legal codes. This is most famously an example of the Code of Hammurabi. And we're going to read that in class as well this week. But you can see the connection between having written language and useful for organizing and controlling the larger numbers of people in these states.
And not beyond just controlling the people, often these legal codes helped reinforce and justify the ruler's power.
Yeah. That image on the left there is Hammurabi receiving the legal code from the god of Babylon. So again, that connection between divinity and earthly power. Speaking of divinity, religious texts became another development of the uses of writing. So we have here an example from the Indus Valley, the story of the Rig Veda, which is going to be a precursor to Hindu beliefs and practices. Zoroaster in ancient Persia, developing and writing down his texts, his religious texts, and this is a fire temple where modern-day Zoroastrians still worship. And also Moses and the Ten Commandments, again, written laws coming from God that also play a central part in unifying a people in these new states.
Great. Next, we're going to take a look at another really important development of these first civilizations. So for earlier, we talked about the developments in terms of political rule, and we looked at cultural developments. Now we're going to look a little bit at economic developments. So there were long-distance trade networks that were developed between some of these first civilizations, and the map that you're looking at shows the connection between the Indus Valley and Mesopotamia. You can see on the map it shows a sea lane that merchants may have used to traverse the seas to get from one place to the other. There also would have been overland trade networks as well. The image that you're looking at is a seal that was found in Mesopotamia that is actually of Indus River Valley origin. So this is actual archaeological evidence that a long-distance trade network developed between these two civilizations. This seal was meant to indicate, or it's a record of trade. Yeah. Next, we're going to talk about the long-distance trade that happened between Egypt and Nubia. So you see, Egypt was really two parts, Lower and Upper Egypt. Note that Lower Egypt is north of Upper Egypt.
And downriver being lower.
Yes.
Yeah.
And Nubia is south of Upper Egypt. And so these civilizations engaged in trade mostly along the Nile River. And so this brings us to a really important consequence of trade, which is cultural diffusion. Cultural diffusion happens when a culture spreads from one place to a new place. So the far right screen shows a pair of statues that illustrate Egyptian, these are Egyptian figurines, okay, and you can see the sort of stereotypical Egyptian style.
Posture of the
exactly.
The
posture,
body.
the clothing, the hairstyle. In the middle, what you see is a Nubian statue. And this Nubian statue really reflects the same kinds of stylistic features of the Egyptian artwork. Again, with the posture of the statue, the clothing, even some of the facial characteristics. Okay. Besides the engaging in trade, another feature of the first civilizations was as they expanded, as the population grew, and these civilizations conquered surrounding territories, and as they expanded, we see more cities develop and a greater diversity of the population. And so, along with that comes changes to gender and social hierarchies that developed. Now, we're going to talk more about this specifically in class. But basically, what we see is a greater level of patriarchy. So, women more and more being relegated to certain kinds of tasks that are separate from men. And in this image, you can see women are off in the background while the men are engaged in making ropes.
Nets, maybe?
Yeah, nets or ropes to make nets. And then, similar with social classes. You start to see more levels of a greater disparity between the wealthy and the not wealthy, and greater variety in terms of the jobs that people are doing, the specialized labor.
Notice the people in the background don't seem to be doing anything labor intensive, maybe overseeing labor or emphasizing that,
Great. Okay, the last part of this key concept is about literature, and the specific examples we're actually going to read excerpts from in class. So I'm not going to say much here because other than stay tuned for exciting things to come this week and next in class.